Before anyone heard the crack of splintering oak, before witnesses argued over what they thought they saw, there was a moment that never made it into any record. A quiet, uneasy pause where everyone in the room sensed they were about to watch something that didn't fit neatly into strength, skill, or spectacle, but something stranger, something harder to explain. If you find yourself drawn to stories about underestimated power, hidden mastery, and moments history tried to forget, go ahead and like and subscribe right now. You'll want to stay with this one as it unfolds. I remember the air that afternoon in 1973 feeling heavier than it should have, thick with chalk dust and expectation, as if the room itself was holding its breath, because this wasn't supposed to be a fight, and it wasn't supposed to be a stunt. Yet everyone present understood instinctively that reputations were about to be tested in a way no one could fully control. The invitation had been deliberately quiet, passed through private phone calls and closed-door conversations, because public spectacle would have poisoned the experiment. This was meant to be clean, contained, almost academic, a comparison, they said, between two kinds of human capability that rarely met on equal terms. On one side stood Bruce Lee, already famous but still relentlessly scrutinized, leaned to the point that newcomers mistook him for fragile, his presence calm in a way that made people underestimate him twice, once for his size, and again for his lack of visible tension. On the other side was Margaret "Iron Maggie" Voss, a woman whose reputation preceded her like a warning label. Nearly 300 pounds of trained mass, hands that coaches swore could end contests without a punch, a grip so renowned that Strength magazine struggled to quantify it without resorting to myth. I had seen strongmen before, seen feats of power that made you question bone density and tendon limits, but Maggie was different. She didn't perform strength, she applied it, methodical and unapologetic, as if force were simply another tool she understood better than most. The room they chose was unremarkable by design, a plain studio space in Burbank with scuffed floors and fluorescent lights that offered no drama, only exposure, and at the center of it all sat the desk, solid oak, thick as a butcher's block, bolted directly into the floor with steel fasteners meant to remove any doubt about stability. That desk wasn't there for symbolism, not officially, but everyone treated it like a measuring device, an unspoken referee that would tell the truth even if the people watching couldn't agree on it later. I noticed how Maggie circled the desk once when she arrived, testing nothing, touching nothing, simply taking inventory the way serious professionals do, while Bruce stood a few steps back with his arms loose at his sides, eyes half-lidded, not avoiding the scene but not engaging with it either, as though he were already somewhere else, running calculations no one else could see. There was no trash talk, no raised voices, just a low hum of restrained skepticism from the observers, many of whom had come convinced that grip was the great equalizer, the final argument against speed and precision, because you could run from punches, but not from hands that closed like steel traps. I remember thinking, irrationally, that the desk looked too perfect, too confident in its own solidity, and that thought made me uneasy, because objects like that only draw attention to themselves when they fail. When the rules were explained, no strikes, no throws, no sudden jerks, just sustained pressure applied openly and honestly. It felt less like a contest and more like a demonstration waiting to choose sides, and I could sense the quiet bias in the room tilting toward mass and numbers, toward the measurable certainty of pounds per square inch. Maggie chalked her hands once, slowly, the sound sharp in the silence, and flexed her fingers as if reminding them of their job, while Bruce said nothing at all, not even a nod, his breathing so even that I had to look twice to be sure he was ready. Someone near me whispered that this was unfair, that grip contests ended careers, that bones didn't care about philosophy, and I remember thinking that maybe that was the point, that maybe this wasn't about winning or losing, but about exposing a misunderstanding that had been allowed to grow too comfortable. As they took their positions, Maggie's hands hovering just above Bruce's forearm, I noticed the way her shadow swallowed his on the floor, a visual metaphor so obvious it felt staged, and yet Bruce didn't flinch, didn't brace, didn't harden the way most people do when they expect impact. Instead, he seemed to soften, to empty himself of resistance, and that, more than anything, made me feel the first real ripple of doubt. The signal hadn't even been given yet, and already the room felt different, as though we'd crossed some invisible line where explanations would lag behind events. And I remember thinking, right before Maggie's hands finally closed, that whatever happened next wouldn't belong cleanly to strength sports or martial arts, but to that strange category of moments people argue about for decades because they challenge the way we think power is supposed to work. The moment the signal was given, the room seemed to contract, as if the walls themselves leaned inward to witness what was about to happen. And I remember being struck by how quiet it became when Iron Maggie's hands finally closed around Bruce Lee's forearm. No cheers, no gasps, just the soft scrape of chalked skin meeting skin and the faint creak of wood as the desk absorbed the first wave of pressure. Maggie didn't rush it. She never did. Her grip came on gradually, deliberately, the way hydraulic systems build force, and within seconds the muscles in her forearm stood out in thick cords, veins rising as if drawn to the surface by sheer will. I had seen men twice Bruce's size wince under far less, had seen confident athletes panic the moment they realized they couldn't pull free, but Bruce didn't react the way anyone expected. He didn't strain backward, didn't twist or jerk or grimace. Instead, his posture changed in a way so subtle I almost missed it. His shoulder dropped a fraction, his elbow rotated inward, and his wrist relaxed rather than tensed, like a door hinge aligning instead of resisting. Maggie increased pressure, confident now, her jaw tightening as she committed fully, and that was when the desk began to protest in earnest, the oak emitting a deep, groaning sound that didn't belong in a room like that, a sound that made one of the physicians shift uneasily and glance at the bolts anchoring it to the floor. Someone muttered that this was enough, that the point had been made, but Maggie hadn't even reached what she considered full output yet, and she leaned in slightly, transferring more of her body weight into her hands, trusting the desk to hold the way it always had. Bruce's face remained unreadable, calm to the point of eeriness, his breathing steady, his eyes focused not on her hands but somewhere beyond them, as if he were feeling for something invisible. Then came the first sharp crack, sudden and loud, like a rifle shot, followed by a second, deeper fracture as the desk's surface split along a natural grain line no one had noticed before. The sound startled everyone, including Maggie, whose eyes flicked downward in surprise, and in that instant of distraction Bruce moved, not explosively, not with the speed people associate with him, but with an efficiency that felt almost surgical. He rotated his forearm further into her grip, aligning bone instead of muscle, and dropped his center of gravity just enough to change the direction of force, and the effect was immediate and violent in a way no one had predicted. The desk gave way completely, the oak slab collapsing inward as the bolts tore free with a metallic shriek, legs snapping outward as if kicked from underneath, papers and chalk dust erupting into the air. Maggie's hands opened reflexively, not from pain but from sudden loss of resistance, the same way a lifter stumbles when a weight unexpectedly vanishes, and Bruce stepped back smoothly, his arm free, unmarked, and still. For a moment no one spoke. Maggie stared at the wreckage in front of her, then at her own hands, flexing them slowly as if to confirm they were still capable of what they'd always been capable of. And I could see the confusion settling in, not the humiliation of defeat, but the deeper discomfort of a rule being broken. "I didn't lose my grip," she said finally, her voice low and certain, and Bruce nodded once, almost respectfully, before replying, "No, the structure did." That single sentence landed harder than the desk had, because it reframed everything we'd just seen, turning brute force into something conditional rather than absolute. The physician moved in quickly, checking Bruce's forearm, expecting swelling, discoloration, anything that would justify what had just happened. But there was nothing. No bruising, no tenderness, no sign that nearly 300 pounds of grip strength had ever been applied. Maggie sank into a nearby chair, exhaling slowly, her confidence shaken not because she'd failed, but because she'd done everything right and still ended up staring at broken furniture instead of a broken opponent. Around the room, the observers exchanged glances, some animated, some unsettled, because they understood instinctively that this wasn't a trick they could easily explain away, not a matter of speed or leverage alone, but something closer to understanding where force wanted to go and letting it go there. I remember thinking then that the desk had told the truth no one else wanted to hear, That raw power, when misdirected, doesn't just fail, it turns inward, destroying the very structures meant to support it. And as the dust settled and the wreckage was quietly cleared away, it became obvious that whatever conclusions people would draw later, none of us would ever look at strength the same way again. By the time the debris was cleared and the broken desk hauled out through a side door, the room felt strangely smaller, as if something essential had been removed along with the splintered oak. And I remember realizing that what lingered wasn't excitement, but a quiet, unsettled respect. No one rushed to fill the silence. Conversations started slowly, in hushed tones, because everyone seemed aware that speaking too loudly would cheapen what had just happened. Iron Maggie stood eventually, rolling her shoulders, testing her hands once more, not in frustration but in contemplation, and when she finally walked over to Bruce, there was no bitterness in her expression, only curiosity sharpened by humility. She asked him how much he trained grip, how much weight he lifted, how he conditioned his forearms, and Bruce answered honestly, almost casually, that he didn't, at least not in the way people expected, that his focus had never been on overpowering resistance, but on understanding it, on learning how force traveled through bodies and objects, and how easily it betrayed those who treated it like a blunt instrument. Maggie laughed softly at that, a sound edged with disbelief, and said that in all her years of competition, no one had ever made her feel weak without actually weakening her. And that realization, she admitted, bothered her more than any loss ever had. The witnesses drifted out in small groups after that, each carrying their own version of the story, already shaping it into something they could live with, some emphasizing the broken desk, others the calm on Bruce's face, others still the fact that Maggie's grip never truly failed, because the human mind has a way of protecting its assumptions by focusing on details that feel safer. Officially, nothing was recorded. No footage was released. The studio quietly replaced the desk and moved on, uninterested in the kind of debate this incident would inevitably spark, and Bruce himself never spoke publicly about it, not out of secrecy, but because, to him, it hadn't been an event worth dramatizing. Yet the story traveled anyway, passed between gyms and training halls, between strength coaches and martial artists, always told with a slight edge of disbelief, always ending the same way. The desk broke, and the man did not. Years later, I heard that Maggie had changed the way she trained, adding elements of alignment and structure to her routines, less concerned with how much force she could generate and more with how it was delivered. And she would occasionally tell younger athletes that grip ended fights only if the other person didn't understand where to stand. As for Bruce, this moment slipped quietly into the growing constellation of stories that followed him after his death, not as proof of invincibility, but as evidence of something far more unsettling. That mastery doesn't always look dramatic, that the most dangerous kind of strength is often invisible, and that sometimes the clearest truth emerges not when a person breaks, but when the world around them does instead.